Welcome to the first webinar in our series coming out of our annual TSX60 Proxy Review. My name is Peter Stevenson. I'm a partner with Hugessen Consulting, and I lead our board effectiveness practice. I'll be your host for today's webinar. As we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of these lands by talking about our firm's and my personal commitment to reconciliation. We are committed to learning more about the Indigenous cultures, histories, and traditions of the Indigenous peoples of these lands and to finding opportunities to contribute to reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and settlers. I make these commitments to reconciliation both personally and on behalf of Hugessen Consulting and encourage our listeners to do the same. Joining me today will be Camille Jovanovic, principal in our Toronto office, Emily Parsons, a manager in our Toronto office, and Margaret Hylas, a principal at Semler Proxy, our affiliate partner in the US. Today's session will focus on emerging trends in environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, factors in compensation and ESG-related themes from this proxy season. First, we'll take a look at high-level trends from the 2022 proxy season in Canada and the US. This will include a few case studies of how companies have integrated ESG into their compensation programs. Second, we will speak to the shareholder proposal landscape and notable results from this year. Finally, Camille, Emily, and Margaret will provide some thoughts about what we may expect looking forward. We have left some time at the end of our presentation to answer any questions you may have. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. All participants are in listen-only mode. Questions can be submitted through the chat feature on the left-hand side of the screen. It looks like a speech bubble. And we encourage you to submit questions as the session proceeds. Finally, today's slides and webinar recording will be shared with all participants following the session and will also be posted on our website. Before we dive into our presentation, I'd like to set the stage in terms of board's oversight of ESG. Boards of directors and the organizations that they govern are facing a fundamental shift in the context for doing business, which some describe as a rise in stakeholder capitalism, climate risk and energy transition, and increasing demands for disclosure of their plans to meet net zero commitments and other ESG goals are requiring boards and their management teams to ensure they have a vision and a roadmap for creating sustainable value for both shareholders and other stakeholders. While a number of TSX60 companies are more advanced in their sustainability strategies, metrics, and disclosure, other companies, including public issuers beyond the TSX60, are at much earlier stages in their journeys. To complicate the situation further, directors, investors, and board advisors hold varying and evolving views about ESG. Some believe that the thoughtful, comprehensive integration of climate and ESG considerations into their business strategies will drive sustainable value creation. Some view the degree of focus on ESG as yielding compliance-driven activity where, in fact, boards and management are focusing on obvious or perhaps easier issues like diversity while avoiding the more complex issues underlying sustainability. Still others view net zero and climate risk as being the existential crisis deserving critical board time and attention, and then everything else ESG. As Canadian regulators work to define regulations and standards, the SEC, the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, and institutional investors are taking action that may in fact necessitate companies making faster progress. It is in this context of an increasing expectation for companies to be able to demonstrate sustainable value creation that we present today's summary of and discussion about the TSX60's companies reporting of how they are linking their climate and ESG strategies to financial outcomes for management. Let me turn things over to Camille to brief us on the 2022 proxy season takeaways and trends in Canada.
Thanks, Peter, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So to set the stage, and as Peter noted, ESG has become an increasingly important part of the board's mandate. As ESG becomes more firmly embedded in a company's strategy and its definition of good performance, a next natural step will be to consider incorporating ESG metrics into incentive programs. This has been driven in part by shareholder and governance community pressures. As the saying goes, what gets measured, and particularly what you get paid for, will get done. The prevalence of ESG metrics in incentive plans has been gaining momentum over the past 5 or so years, and particularly in 2020 and 2021 throughout the COVID pandemic, as many companies paused to consider their role in society and their duties to all stakeholders beyond just shareholders. So the key takeaway from the 2022 proxy season, and as you see on the screen here, as it relates to ESG in compensation, is the continued momentum and an intensification of the trends that we saw in 2020 and 2021. So to structure our review of the key themes from this proxy season, we'll first speak a little bit to the prevalence of ESG metrics in incentive plans among TSX60 companies. Then we'll take a closer look at structurally where within the compensation programs they sit, and then finally the specific types of metrics that the companies are measuring. In terms of prevalence, by now most TSX60 companies have formally incorporated ESG into their executive compensation plans in some capacity, or have disclosed the intention to do so for 2022. Of the approximately 20 TSX60 companies that have not yet formally incorporated ESG into their programs, 5 of these have taken what we consider to be the first step in doing so by basing some portion of the individual executives' assessments on their achievement against ESG metrics. It's also worth noting that most of the TSX60 companies that have not yet incorporated ESG into their incentive plans at all appear to be in the relatively earlier stages of developing their broader company ESG strategies. And so we would feel that in these cases, it would likely be premature to incorporate ESG in their incentive plans to begin with. So now talking about how structurally we are seeing companies incorporate ESG metrics into their incentive plans. Short-term plans remain the most common instrument, though we have seen an increasing number of examples of companies that have incorporated ESG metrics into their PSUs as well. Among the TSX60 companies that include ESG metrics as discrete objectives within their short-term plans, these metrics are weighted on average at about 20%, and that's been pretty stable for the past several years. That said, though, throughout this proxy season, we have seen a theme of intensification of ESG metrics in incentive programs, where several companies have significantly increased either the relative weight or the number of ESG metrics within their incentive plans. A few notable examples are shown on this slide: Algonquin, CN Rail, Pembina, and CIBC. Of course, one of the challenges with increasing the weight of ESG metrics in scorecards is that naturally you would then have to reduce the weighting of another metric. In these particular examples, the increased weight on ESG metrics has largely represented a reduction or rebalancing of other operational or strategic metrics rather than reducing the weight on financial metrics. While most companies do incorporate ESG metrics within their short-term plans, incorporating ESG metrics into long-term incentives is seen in some ways as a next step and a more natural fit for ESG metrics given the longer-term nature of many ESG objectives within company strategies. There were several new examples of companies incorporating ESG metrics into their PSUs this proxy season, including Waste Connections, which added an ESG metric into its PSUs, and Tech and Fortis have disclosed the intention to do so for 2022. Emily will speak to a couple of these examples in more detail shortly. Now speaking about how ESG is measured and the specific types of metrics we're seeing in compensation programs among TSX60 companies. So as a guiding principle, companies should only incorporate ESG metrics, or frankly, any metrics, into their compensation programs when they have a clear and well understood link to the company's strategy. As such, the types of ESG metrics that we typically see in compensation programs can be generalized by industry, with companies in the extractive industries often emphasizing environmental metrics, while companies in the financial services, retail, and telecom industries, among others, often emphasizing the S or social metrics related to their customer base and employees. That said, a key theme that we have observed this proxy season has been the increased emphasis for all companies on environmental and particularly climate-related metrics. 22 TSX60 companies have either added or increased the weighting of environmental metrics within their programs in 2021 or have disclosed the intention to do so for 22. Of these 22 companies, 15 are outside of the extractive industry, so indicating that more industries beyond just the extractives are starting to focus on climate and environmental metrics. In addition to the increased emphasis on environmental metrics this proxy season, we also saw several companies increase their emphasis on S or social type metrics through the inclusion of diversity and community-based measures as noted on this slide. Another way that we categorize ESG metrics is thinking about them as leading versus lagging. So when we talk about lagging metrics, there tend to be backwards looking objectives such as safety or environmental event monitoring metrics. And these have been common in incentive plans for years. They represent the foundational, fundamental operational metrics that are key to a company's license to operate. And while they still fall within the ESG category, they don't necessarily represent that more transformational or forward-looking philosophy that we're starting to think about when we think about ESG, and that frankly shareholders and the community at large is focusing on as well. And so these transformational or forward-looking metrics, that's what we refer to as leading metrics. A key theme from this proxy season has been the increased emphasis on these leading metrics within compensation programs, and specifically the climate-focused leading metrics. So to get into some of the specific data, we observed 25 TSX60 companies with a leading type environmental metric within their compensation programs. And of these, 19 of them either added this new leading metric or increased the emphasis of an existing metric in their program. So this to us speaks to a high degree of momentum in changing the types of metrics we are observing within the broader ESG category. As mentioned, these leading type metrics among the TSX60 are primarily climate related and mainly focused on emissions reductions and sustainable financing. It's interesting to note that 12 TSX60 companies outside of the extractive industries adopted a leading type climate metric in this year. So again, thinking about the full economy as being focused on climate related objectives. For example, several of the banks added progress toward climate action plans or longer term sustainable financing goals as measures within a broader group of ESG metrics. So to sum it up, what we're seeing this proxy season has been an intensification and increased momentum of the adoption of ESG metrics into incentive programs for companies in all industries. And by ESG, we're really meaning E, and by E, we really mean climate. So let me pass this over to Margaret to provide us with some insights from the US 2022 proxy season. Thanks, Margaret.
Thanks, Camille. And it's great to be here with everyone today. I'll take us through some of the themes that we're seeing in the United States, which are really quite similar to a lot of the themes that we're hearing about in Canada as well. Pressure from shareholders and regulatory bodies has pushed more and more companies towards thinking about ESG as a key priority more broadly. And when it comes to incentive program design, there's been a sharp uptick in companies incorporating ESG metrics in their incentive design in recent years. We track the S&P 500 in the United States and the companies in the S&P 500 that are using ESG metrics in their incentive compensation design. And the data for this year is still coming in, but what we're seeing is that around 70% of companies in the S&P 500 have some form of an ESG metric in their compensation design, which is up from 57% last year. For the last few years, we've been saying it's coming. ESG is becoming a bigger part of incentive compensation design. And I think that now we can definitively say that ESG is a component of executive compensation design for many companies. Most large US companies are incorporating ESG metrics in incentive design in some capacity. One area that is a little bit different in the US and Canada and what we're seeing is that diversity and inclusion and human capital management metrics more broadly are the area where we've seen the vast majority of the focus in the last few years. COVID and the pressures that it put on the workforce, along with a lot of the social and racial unrest that we saw in the United States over the course of the last few years, has put diversity, equity, and inclusion and human capital management more broadly top of mind for many companies. Last year, diversity and inclusion metrics were the clear leading metric when it came to the ways that companies were incorporating ESG and incentive design. And this year, that trend has become more intense. 46% of companies in the S&P 500 use some kind of diversity and inclusion metric or factor in their incentive design, which is up from 28% last year. There's also been an uptick in other types of measures as well. Carbon footprint metrics are in 16% of S&P 500 companies in the US, which is up from 5% last year. So we're seeing a lot of real movement on some of these numbers and the ways that companies are including ESG metrics in their compensation design. Let me hand things over to Emily to share some case studies of companies who have incorporated ESG metrics into their compensation plans. Thanks, Emily.
Thanks, Margaret. So I'll just walk through a few examples both in the STIP and LTIP where we've seen ESG measures incorporated. So as Camille indicated, the STIP scorecard is where we most often see the ESG measures included. So the first is what we're calling a bucket approach, whereby a company has a portion of its scorecard that includes various metrics with unspecified weights. So Enbridge, for example, has a 30% bucket in its scorecard that includes greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals and enterprise-wide increased diversity and inclusion within their workforce. The next approach is a discrete measure, which is how we most often see other types of measures, such as in financial and operational, incorporated into a corporate scorecard. So CN Rail has 5 discrete ESG-related metrics in its STIP, including fuel efficiency, customer centricity, employee engagement, and safety metrics. And each of those metrics has its own distinct weighting in the STIP with a cumulative weighting of 30% on ESG. Finally, there are also some instances where a modifier is used. So this is a mechanism outside of the scorecard that can modify the results up or down based on predetermined criteria. Scotiabank has incorporated a strategic and operational modifier, which is a plus or minus 10% adjustment based on a bucket of measures. Here are several measures, including DE&I, culture, and employee engagement. So each of these approaches has their pros and cons depending on where a company is at in its ESG strategy development or life cycle. So as you can imagine, using a bucket approach can lend itself to more of a discretionary assessment, but may allow for a more holistic view of performance, whereas a discrete metric would suggest a clearer sense of performance targets and shoulders, but would require focusing in on one or two key metrics. Moving on to the LTIP, and so specifically PSUs or performance share units, that's where we see the long-term performance metrics incorporated. One way that companies are starting to tie LTIPs to ESG measures is through front-end performance conditioning, whereby the STIP scorecard result determines the size of the LTIP grants. So this approach is taken at some of the banks, at CNRL and Canadian Properties REIT, just to name a few. But some issuers have gone a step further and have added ESG measures to the performance share unit assessment at the back end. So the measures that are used to evaluate a plan at the end of its performance period and determine the payout to participants. So the use of ESG measures in an LTIP is viewed as a leading practice, as it, first of all, is better aligned with the long-term nature of many ESG metrics. And also the LTIP typically makes up a greater proportion of the total direct compensation package for an executive. And so the metrics can have a bigger impact. So one example highlighted here is Tech Resources, where they have a 20% sustainability progress index weighting. This is through 5 metrics, each weighted 4%. And to highlight a couple, the climate change target is tied to a goal of reducing its carbon intensity by 33% by the year 2030. The tailings facilities management metric is tied to implementation of the global industry standards on tailing. And the equity, diversity, and inclusion metric is tied to increasing the percentage of women at the company. So now, Margaret, it'd be great if you could walk us through some of the examples that you're seeing of ESG metrics being incorporated at US companies.
Great, thanks, Emily. At US companies, similarly, there are a wide range of approaches for how companies actually incorporate ESG in incentive design. And a minority of companies report explicit, discrete metrics weighted in their incentive plan that are tied to ESG metrics. Most companies use some type of a scorecard approach, which is similar to the bucket construct that Emily was just describing, where ESG accounts for something like 20% of the design, but there's some degree of discretion around which metrics the company uses each year. 23% of S&P 500 companies that use ESG metrics do so with a discrete weighted metric, and 41% use something more like a scorecard metric or a bucket approach. We also see many companies using a more individualized metric or a more discretionary approach where ESG is a factor that a company considers when determining compensation outcomes, but it's not necessarily an explicit component of the design. So that might be something along the lines of the committee considers factors related to ESG when determining an individual's payout, but there aren't necessarily explicit goals reported publicly and progress on those goals isn't reported publicly. And we see 28% of companies with some sort of ESG metric in the S&P 500 use that type of an approach. I'll take you through some specific case studies as well in the United States. The first one is Visa. In 2021, Visa included an ESG section in their annual incentive scorecard, and the committee has discretion to set goals and adjust weightings for the scorecard metric, so they can change it each year exactly what the explicit weightings are. And it gives the company flexibility to adjust different ESG issues that arise over time. The next example, Verizon. Verizon takes a very rigorous approach to measuring and paying for ESG and has for a long time. They have a structured metric with a carve-out that counts for 10% of the company's annual incentive plan and is based on 3 discrete ESG metrics related to diversity and sustainability, each with established quantitative performance goals that they report on. And finally, MasterCard. In 2021, MasterCard implemented a corporate ESG modifier that applies to executive vice presidents and the named executive officer team. I'll pass it back over to Emily, who can start speaking about shareholder perspectives.
Thanks, Margaret. So in turning our focus to shareholder proposals coming out of the 2022 proxy season, it's important to take a step back and note that the regulatory environment in Canada and the US is such that the government has not stepped in to provide clear guidance on the appropriate methodology for ESG disclosure, nor its integration into executive incentive programs. And so in this vacuum, we have observed shareholders taking various approaches to engaging companies on ESG related items and a wide variety of shareholder proposals. So we've observed a significant increase in environment and ESG related shareholder proposals since 2021, the 2021 proxy season, and have also seen an increase in the degrees of support for these proposals. So one ESG related proposal has passed thus far in Canada this season, which is Constellation Software. Their shareholders voted 63% in support of a proposal for the board to prepare a report outlining the corporation's plan to identify, address, mitigate, and dismantle racial disparities within its workforce. So interestingly, Constellation is one of the 16 companies in the TSX60 that does not integrate ESG metrics into its compensation programs. And this just might be an example of shareholders seeking an indication of an ESG focus from the board, and compensation plans are one method that boards convey this focus. Metro shareholders also demonstrated significant support for two proposals on environmental issues. One was a proposal on commitments to preserving biodiversity, which received 37% support, and a proposal to develop an action plan to achieve zero plastic waste by 2030, which received 29% support. While neither of these passed, this indicates a high degree of shareholder support relative to previous years, which potentially indicates increased focus on these types of matters going forward as well. We also observed proposals to incorporate a non-binding say on climate vote. They were submitted at each of the 6 largest Canadian banks and received between 15 to 27% support. So say on climate is an advisory vote on a company's approach to climate risk. So it's similar to say on pay in that the results of the vote are non-binding, but viewed as indicators of shareholder perspectives on these issues. CN Rail and CP Rail are the only companies in the Canadian market to voluntarily adopt these votes thus far. They received support of 98% at CN and 87% at CP this year. We will note, though, that opponents of Say on Climate have voiced concerns about information asymmetry between companies and investors and the governance implication of what could be viewed as a say on strategy. And on that topic of opposition to certain environment-related shareholder proposals, BlackRock published a report recently indicating that it will not support most shareholder resolutions on climate change this year, saying that they have become too extreme and/or prescriptive. And they specifically cited proposals to stop financing fossil fuel companies. We often see shareholder proposal trends from the US make their way into Canada a year or two later. So with that in mind, Margaret, it would be great if you shared some thoughts on what we saw coming out of the US proxy season.
Great, of course. In the United States, major shareholders have clarified their stances on ESG-related proposals. Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, among others, have clarified their framework and stances on various ESG-related topics, and we're seeing a lot of other bodies and groups clarify their own perspectives on ESG-related topics. Proxy advisors this year focused heavily on some of the non-compensation-related items, such as board diversity, unequal voting rights, climate-related policies, and environmental and social risk oversight. In March of 2022, the United States Securities and Exchange Commission proposed significant new disclosure requirements to enhance and standardize disclosures related to climate risks. And unlike existing ESG disclosure requirements, which have largely been principles-based, these requirements would include more prescriptive elements aimed at enhancing comparability and consistency. And both US listed and foreign private issuers would be required to include information in a new section of their annual report entitled Climate-Related Disclosures. And if adopted, it would impact the landscape around ESG reporting in the United States. When it comes to shareholder proposals around ESG, shareholders have voted so far this year on 80 social proposals and 25 environmental proposals in 2022. The median vote support is 25% for 25 and 26% respectively for shareholder proposals in both of those categories. 6 social proposals, so 10% of them, and 3 environmental proposals, 18% of them, have thus far received greater than 50% support so far in 2022. Now I think I'll pass it back to, so now we're going to talk a little bit about what we expect looking forward over the course of the next year to few years. In the United States, I think what we are seeing right now is that there's been a lot of movement and activity, especially in the compensation world related to ESG and incentive compensation design. And I don't think we're going to see as many dramatic shifts as we have seen in this space so far. Now around in the US, 70% of companies have some type of ESG related metric and incentive design. And we're not expecting a dramatic uptick in that number so far, but what I think we will start to see is a little bit more structure and consistency around what those types of ESG metrics look like. And that could happen in a few ways. We might start to see more companies using discrete weighted metrics. We might start to see more companies using the bucket approach or the scorecard approach that we've talked about today. And we might start to see companies move away from evaluating ESG as sort of an individual factor and put it in compensation design more formally. I think the second thing that we expect to see is refined approaches to measuring ESG. A lot of companies have made changes to their programs in recent years and are really kind of figuring out how to make ESG metrics and incentive design something that is consistent and they can work into their strategy each year. And so a lot of companies we expect will modify the metrics, refine them a little bit, think about how they do or don't help drive longer term strategy related to ESG over time. Camille, what are the trends that you anticipate seeing in Canada with regards to integrating ESG and compensation?
So generally, first of all, a lot of overlap between what we're seeing or what we expect to see in Canada. The trends we identified looking forward, we expect the momentum seen this proxy season to continue, with companies continuing to incorporate ESG metrics at higher weights within their short-term plans. Though that said, I expect those will likely be subject to some cap in the 20 to 30% range, not wanting to underemphasize other important metrics such as profitability. It's likely as well that we will continue to see more companies incorporate ESG metrics into their PSUs, and with a real focus on climate-related metrics for companies in all industries, which we had identified earlier in the presentation. A likely next step will be increased scrutiny of the metrics and the targets themselves. So similar to what we see for financial and operational metrics, the more conventional incentive plan design metrics, we expect that shareholders will start to look for additional clarity and disclosure from companies as to why they've selected these particular metrics, why are these the most relevant for your business, why are these material to your operations, and how do they link back to the company's strategy. Taking that one step further, we also expect that there will begin to be increasing scrutiny around the specific targets themselves and whether they represent meaningful progress against the company's ESG strategy. Are these tough enough targets? Again, similar dynamics to what we see in the financial space. Though, of course, the challenge with the scrutiny of the targets is simply at this stage, a lack of information and a lack of standardization across companies. So we think that's coming, but it's challenging in practice. So to conclude the content portion of our discussion before we transition into the Q&A, the nature of the metrics that we are dealing with here are new. And companies and boards are building their competence and their confidence and comfort level with understanding the material ESG metrics and factors, frankly, for their organizations in the many complexities and trade-offs that come with them. However, the underlying incentive design fundamental principles remain the same. All we're trying to thoughtfully design programs that are meant to drive strong performance and positive outcomes for all stakeholders. And so with that, I'll invite my colleagues to join me on the screen, and we will open it up to Q&A from the audience.
Thank you, Camille, Margaret, and Emily for sharing these 2022 proxy season insights. A lot of really helpful and valuable information there. I also want to thank you participants who have submitted questions, and a reminder that if you want to ask questions, please use that chat function on the left-hand side of your screen. So a couple that have come in, I've sort of merged a couple of these together, and Margaret, I think I'll pass the first one over to you. These are for folks that are sort of earlier in their journey. How should we be thinking about starting to incorporate ESG into our incentive plans?
Great, thanks, Peter. So ESG metrics work well for many companies, but perhaps not all companies' compensation programs. And they work best when they're designed thoughtfully. Adding metrics that are in the news or that appear in many peer programs is not necessarily best suited for all businesses. And so I'd caution any company thinking about it to sort of take a step back and think about why you're thinking about it. Is there some type of strategic priority that you're marching towards? Is there something that's really cohesive with your broader strategy that makes a lot of sense? Or have you heard that there are ESG metrics in incentive design, and is that what's sparking the conversation? So I encourage companies to sort of take a step back and think about how and why ESG does tie back to their broader strategic priorities, and start by determining the business's most important ESG issues. Ideally, ESG compensation metrics should be relevant to both business strategy and one or more key stakeholders. For example, factors related to the business are factors related to the company's core business or core mission, or directly related to the company's expertise or represent a significant business potential, opportunity or risk. They should also be relevant to key stakeholders like customers, suppliers, employees, or the broader community. So I'd encourage companies to sort of think first about what is the broader ESG goal for the company, and then think about compensation.
That's really some helpful insights there, Margaret. And just there must be a few skeptics in the audience today, because I had a couple of questions, and Camille, perhaps I'll pass this one over to you. Do you believe that ESG specifically linked to executive compensation is the flavor of the day and may pass if financial performance starts to suffer? So is this just the latest bandwagon that people are climbing on?
Thanks, Peter, for the tough question. So there's no doubt that most conventional investors will continue to be focused on financial performance and short-term quarterly results. As Emily mentioned earlier, while BlackRock has certainly been a consistently strong voice in favor of ESG, we're all familiar with Larry Fink's annual letter to CEOs and to companies. They have come out as being against some of the more extreme or controversial environment-related shareholder proposals. So practically, how to manage the trade-off as companies start to think through incorporating ESG metrics into their programs, it'll be important to continue to balance those metrics with key financial metrics and be conscious of the trade-offs when adding new metrics. By nature of the design of our incentive programs, it is a bit of a zero-sum game. And so when you're adding something by virtue of math, you're taking away from something else. So thinking about both the trade-offs, but also the signaling implications of adding new metrics to the programs. There are also some creative incentive design concepts that both Margaret and Emily spoke to earlier, the concept of a modifier, a bucket of several ESG metrics that can be applied to the incentive outcomes in creative ways and to incorporate some degree of board judgment. For example, if there's a year where you do really well on your ESG commitments, but poorly financially, some degree of judgment and common sense can be applied to the incentive outcomes. That all being said, ESG does not seem to be going away anytime soon. And as companies evolve their thinking and approach to incorporating ESG into their broader strategy and their broader definition of company success, as opposed to kind of a bolt-on element of their business, I think it will be natural to want to include ESG metrics as a key measure of company success if it truly is part of your integrated company strategy.
Thanks, Camille, for those insights. Several questions that are related, and perhaps Emily, I'll pass this one to you, around what are some of the common pitfalls then to be aware of as you begin to incorporate ESG metrics? Thoughts on that, Emily?
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, so the first thought that comes to mind is really the challenge that we observe with all metrics. So ensuring that companies are incentivizing the right behaviors, and particularly when they're found in short-term incentive plans, boards will need to ensure that short-term activities are aligned with their long-term goals. So for example, if you incorporated a DE&I goal and it is met by hiring several new employees, but those new employees are not successfully integrated into the company or trained or promoted, that would be counterintuitive to the long-term success of a DE&I strategy. Similarly, it will be important to ensure that ESG goals are complementary to the other corporate measures in place, including financial goals and operational goals. So the financial budget metrics should be budgeted with the ESG goals and required activities and expenditures in mind. Another concern that we've heard several clients raise is setting appropriate targets. And that's not necessarily because these metrics are qualitative in nature. Quantitative metrics in this ESG space include greenhouse gas reduction targets, water waste reduction targets, increasing BIPOC representation at the executive level. But we are observing some stress around what the right target is. Particularly given the sensitive nature of these metrics, there is a discomfort with disclosing the fact that a target was not met or receiving backlash if the targets are perceived as being insufficient. So, when companies are in these types of situations, one approach may be to track these measures in the background for a year prior to formally introducing them into incentive plans, just to take a first step at the target setting and the assessment process and build up some confidence to that approach. But at the end of the day, what this really ties to is just like a financial metric, just like an operational metric, the ESG measures need to be grounded in the company's strategy and with a strong underlying rationale that informs the view of what success looks like. And even beyond that, when we think about a qualitative measure or a quantitative measure, as we all know, it's not just about what target achievement looks like, but what does maximum achievement look like? And what does threshold or zero achievement look like? So starting to have those conversations sooner than later and giving yourself some runway before that pressure really gets there to start incorporating these plans will be important. And so I think we're going to see even more of these discussions at the board level.
Thanks very much, Emily. This has been a great discussion, but I'm mindful of time, and so I'm going to draw this webinar to a close. Thank you again, Margaret, Camille, and Emily, for sharing these insights with us. And thank you to all of you who have attended today's webinar. A reminder that a recording of the webinar and a copy of the slides will be sent to each of you and will also be posted on our website. And if you have additional questions, or if we were not able to get to your specific question today, please email them to us at email@hugessen.com. That's email@hugessen.com. Thank you again for participating with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.